Any questions before we get started? Okay, so game plan for tonight is to finish up chapter 3, and we're going to really complete the discussion we had kind of barely started last time on audit sampling, and then we're going to get into the new module 10 for chapter 3, which is going to give us some information about data analytics. I think you're going to see that most of that at this point, as data analytics grows over the next several years on the exam, that right now it's mainly descriptive in some of the things that we're going to be looking at about data analytics. And then we'll get into chapter 4, and we're going to start talking about various transaction cycles. And I'm going to try to get through most of those transaction cycles tonight, and then we'll have some additional things from chapter 4 that we'll get into next time. Okay, any question before we get going on any of that? Okay, good. Then I'm going to go ahead and put myself in tablet mode here. And let's just go ahead and let's go back for a second. Okay, and I just want to go back to these couple of tables that we talked about last time to review some of the key things that we had learned from the first couple of pages of the module here, module 8 on audit sampling. Okay, and you can see here that we had these two summary charts, and one was related to substantive testing. The other was related to test of controls. Okay, and we're going to be using sampling for those two types of tests because you are not going to be able to review 100% of the transactions to see if they were recorded right in the financial statements for a substantive purpose, or if a particular control was applied to those for our testing of control purposes. So when we talk about our substantive tests, we have the risk of incorrect acceptance, the risk of incorrect rejection. Okay, and the way this table worked was that the sample said that the population was okay, and the examiners, nobody really knows if a population is actually okay or not. There's no misstatement in there or not, material misstatement in there or not. Nobody really knows that for sure, but the examiners can say the assumption is that the population is okay and the sample indicates that the population is okay, then we're fine, we have a correct decision. If the sample indicates that the population is okay and it is not okay, then this is the risk of incorrect acceptance. Our audit is not going to be effective because based on the sample, we thought there was not a material misstatement. Meanwhile, there actually was a material misstatement. We should have modified our opinion somehow. Instead, we gave the unmodified, unqualified opinion. We incorrectly accepted those financial statements, risk of incorrect acceptance. Obviously, the audit is not effective. That's audit failure, right? You didn't modify your opinion appropriately, okay? Now, just coming and looking at the next row here, if the sample indicates that the population is not okay and it's really not okay, that's a correct decision. If the sample indicates that the population is not okay when it actually is okay, the examiners tell us that, then we have suffered the risk of incorrect rejection and our audit is not going to be efficient. And remember, we said that if we believe there's a material misstatement in those financial statements, we will keep working to figure out, well, what's the nature of the misstatement? How much is it? What sort of an adjustment do we want? And eventually we'll come to the correct conclusion, right? That, hey, there's not a misstatement after all. We just don't get there very efficiently. So our audit will not be as efficient. For our test of controls, if the sample indicates that the population is okay and it really is okay, that's a correct decision. If the sample indicates that the population is okay and it's not okay, in other words, what? The control was not having operating effectiveness. It was not applied consistently enough for us to have supported a lower assessed level of control risk below the maximum. If that's the case, now we have suffered the risk of assessing control risk too low, and there's a danger that our audit is not going to be effective because we didn't alter the timing, extent, and nature of our substantive procedures sufficiently for an assessment of control risk that was not appropriate. Why was it not appropriate? Because the sample indicated that the control had operating effectiveness, that the population was okay, when in fact it was not okay. And so our audit is not going to be effective if we suffer the risk of assessing control risk too low. If the sample indicates the population is not okay, and of course it really is not okay, that's the correct decision. If the sample indicates the population is not okay when it is okay, in other words, the sample indicates that the control did not have operating effectiveness, when in fact, if we had looked at the entire population, we would have found that the control does have the operating effectiveness. We can support a lower assessed level control risk. So what will happen? Well, we'll do too much substantive testing probably in that case. Our audit will still be effective, but we won't be very efficient in how we're going about things, because now for our substantive procedures, we're using external evidence, nature, instead of internal evidence. We're taking larger sample sizes for our substantive testing than we really needed to. Extent, timing, we're doing our testing at year end instead of interim. Okay. All right. Any question on that? So that was sort of a summary of what we had started to talk about last time. So now what I want to do is just start here and with new stuff now for our discussion tonight. And we're going to start out talking about using sampling for test of controls. And remember, we said last time that is referred to as attribute sampling. You are looking at a transaction to see if it contains a certain attribute. The attribute, for example, being that time cards are signed by the supervisor, okay, properly authorized, okay? It's a yes or no question. That's how our control testing goes. Hey, either it has a signature or it does not. That's called attribute testing. We use that sort of testing in our sampling for our test of controls. Now, they come over and they start talking about planning considerations, okay? And we have something called tolerable deviation rate. Now, what I want you to put here is this is a planned deviation rate. Now, we call it planned here together for our discussion. The exam, the terminology calls it tolerable deviation rate, but it is a planned deviation rate, okay? So what happens? Let's say I tell you that the supervisor will sign the employee's time card. Do you like the design of that control? Supervisor will sign the employee's time card. Do you like the design of that control?
Yes.
Yeah, supervisor should know how many hours the employee worked, what they worked on, et cetera. Good. Okay, now we have to see if the control has been implemented. So we'll do a walkthrough. We'll get there early and we'll see that the supervisor is there ahead of the staff and they're observing that the staff is logging, what do you call it? Punching in, whatever, logging in. And they are, directing their efforts, and they're there when employees are taking appropriate breaks, and when they leave at the end of the night, the supervisor is still there, etc. So we say, okay, that control has been implemented. So based on what? Our obtaining the understanding, looking at the design, seeing that the control has been implemented, we make an assessment of the risk of material misstatement, and we assess it at less than the maximum. Now, we look at that control and we say, that control is pretty important. So I'm going to look at 100 time cards, and I'm willing to accept no more than 3 times that the supervisor did not sign the time card. Well, in that situation, 3 divided by 100, of course, is 3%. So now my tolerable deviation rate is the maximum rate of deviation from that prescribed control, the supervisor signing the time card, that I am willing to tolerate before I will determine, hey, the control does not have operating effectiveness. Now at this point, have I looked at any time cards yet? Other than the 1 or 2 I looked at during the walkthrough?
No.
No.
No. At this point, I haven't looked at any of the time cards yet. I'm just saying, hey, I've determined that for this particular control, I'm willing to tolerate a 3% deviation, no more than that. We call that tolerable deviation rate, but notice it's a planned deviation rate. I haven't looked at one time card yet, okay? Now, they come down here and they say deviation rate versus tolerable rate. And of course, they don't compare them, so I'm not sure why they're saying versus, but they say deviation rate is the auditor's estimate of the deviation rate in the population from which the sample was pulled. Okay, so this now is going to be actual deviation rate. Now, again, I put parentheses, what do you call those, quotes on that, because the literature doesn't call it actual. They call it tolerable deviation rate. They call it deviation rate. But I'm just trying to illustrate to you by calling it actual. Okay. So let's say I look at 100 time cards. Now I pull my sample. I look at 100 and I find 2 that are not signed. What's my deviation rate? Not a trick question.
2%.
2%. Okay, good. So I ask you, is this auditor happy or sad?
Happy.
This auditor is happy because they're saying, hey, I was willing to tolerate up to 3% and I'm down at 2%. I now believe that this control has operating effectiveness and I can now lower the nature, extent, and timing of my substantive procedure. I can accept a higher detection risk. Good. Okay. Now let's say, and I think you probably know where this is going, I look at the 100 time cards. These are mutually exclusive examples, right? I look at the 100 time cards and let's say now I find 100. A 4 out of 100 that are not signed. Now what's my deviation rate? Not a trick question.
4%.
4%. Is this auditor happy or sad?
Sad.
Now this auditor is sad, okay, unless they had some sort of fetish for substantive testing, because what? Now the auditor is saying, the control does not have operating effectiveness. I was hopeful that it would after I did my obtaining the understanding phase steps, but now I have to go up and say that the control risk is at the maximum. My risk of material misstatement is at the maximum. So now nature, extent, timing of audit procedure. I need to drive down my detection risk, nature. I'm going to use external evidence instead of internal evidence, larger sample sizes, extent, timing. I'm going to do my testing at year end. Okay. Now, if the auditor had what? A tolerable deviation rate of 6%, then the auditor would be what? Would be happy in either of these cases. Okay. So the happiness or sadness of the auditor in these cases are predicated on how the deviation rate does what? Compares to their tolerable rate. Okay. Any question? Okay, good. So you come down a little bit and go ahead and flashcard, by the way, the definition of tolerable deviation rate. Just go ahead and flashcard that definition right there. Okay, good. And you come over and let's look at this attribute sampling example. Okay, so what we just did was just sort of a definitional term of tolerable versus deviation rate. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to walk through an example that's going to be a little more detailed, a little bit more robust in terms of describing what the process would be. Okay, that was just sort of a quick little example that was designed to help us just understand the terminology. So now we're going to go through and we're going to look at this example. This is a really good example, actually. Okay, so the first thing we will do is define the objective of our test. And in this example, they're going to look at sales order and they're going to see that the sales order has the appropriate credit approval. Now, what the auditor is looking is to see that the clients have a sales order, right? When they have a sale, there'll be a sales order. And they're looking to see that what? There's some sort of star on there that says credit approval, or probably more realistic as to how they look at it. They're looking for one that what? doesn't have the credit approval, because that's going to be a deviation. Now, why would the auditor be interested in understanding and seeing if there's operating effectiveness over this control of there being credit approval by the client? Why does the auditor care?
I would think that has an effect on your accounts receivable, essentially, because if you're not approving their credit, you're selling to bad credit customers, you may not get that money coming in.
Good. So we're talking about the accounts receivable, and you're saying that if we don't do the appropriate credit approval, there's a chance that the client won't collect on that receivable, right?
Yes.
Why does the auditor care?
So that would be an existence assertion. And there's a risk of material misstatement.
Good. There's a risk of material misstatement. You're almost there, man. I mean, you're doing a really good job here, okay? But I don't know that I agree with existence, because even though the person can't pay the money because they're, not a very good credit risk, does that mean that they don't exist?
No, it doesn't. It should be a valuation, maybe.
Excellent. Good work. Good work. Good. Okay, so there's a couple of really excellent things you did there. One, you thought about what, from the standpoint of an auditor. A lot of times I ask that question and they say, well, because we want our client to get paid. I don't care if they collect. I mean, maybe I do, but what I really want is to have them have the right amounts in the financial statements. I'm looking for material misstatement. That's what the auditor's here for. And when I look at material misstatement, I look at material misstatements in what? In the assertions. I think of financial statements as assertion. Good. And I look for controls that prevent or detect the misstatement in the assertion. So even though they may be saying, hey, I've got $1 million of account receivable, if they, lended credit to a bunch of, deadbeats, whatever, that aren't going to be able to pay, and lack of a better term for poor individuals that aren't going to be able to pay, then they're going to have to write a lot of those off. And so I'm going to have to devalue the account receivable. So it's a valuation issue. Excellent. Excellent. We're thinking this control has the potential to prevent or detect that misstatement. So now we're going to use sampling to see if indeed that control has operating effectiveness, if it was applied consistently throughout the year. We know that we saw it during the walkthrough, but that's when we're there kind of obtaining an understanding, and our clients, I should say, are on their best behavior, right? Now we want to say, hey, when we're not there, when we're not breathing over someone's shoulder, are they still applying that control consistently? We have a phrase for that. We are testing for operating effectiveness. Okay. Okay, good. So now we come over and we define the population, and they tell us that in this example, any question on that? I kind of jumped quickly away from that discussion. Okay, good. Okay, in this example now, I want this. In this example, the population would consist of all sales orders used during the year. Okay, so we have to make sure that all sales orders used during the year have an equal opportunity of being selected into our sample. So when we define the sampling unit, each sales order is the sampling unit. Okay, and notice they tell us here that we are looking for the missing credit approval. And they tell us that if the sales order is missing, then we consider that a deviation, right? It's not like, hey, we can't find sales order 103. Oh, really? Gee, I don't know where that went. Gee, that came up in your sample. Hey, Bob, was that one having the credit approval? Yeah, it was. No. Doesn't work that way. If we can't look at it to see that it has the credit approval because it's missing, we consider that a deviation from the control. Okay. Okay, good. Then we are going to determine the sample size. Now we're going to look and we're going to actually use a numeric example to see how these different factors affect sample size in a minute. But right now, I'm going to need you to flashcard how these different factors affect sample size. And so let's just take a look at them. Starting with the risk of assessing control risk too low. Okay. And they say that the risk of assessing control risk, okay, is based, what do I want to put here? Okay, I don't want to highlight that part because we've already talked about the risk of assessing control is too low, but right here, there is an inverse relationship to sample size. As the auditor is willing to accept greater risk, a smaller sample can be used. Okay, and I want you to flashcard here how these different factors are affected, how sample size is affected by these different factors. Okay, and we say here that it is an inverse relationship. So let's think about this for a second. Remember, we talked about a barrel of apples, and I told you, hey, you know, there's 100 apples in this barrel, and some of them may be poison. And I ask you if you'd like to try them, and you're like, no, thank you. And I sit there and I say, okay, look, we'll test the apples. And we test 10 of them, and it comes back, our little testing machine, which is infallible, says, hey, no poison apples. I throw the 10 apples back in the barrel, mix it up, and say, would you like an apple? And you say, no, because there's always a chance that what? The sample is not going to be indicative of the population. You might reach in and grab a poison apple. So I say, okay, I'll test 20. I'll test 30. I'll test 40. I'll test 50. I'll test 90. And you start feeling more comfortable with the results of that sample, the more apples I test, right? Now, in a situation like that, where there's a chance that you're going to die if the sample is not representative of the population, you'd probably say, hey, no sample size is big enough. I want you to test all 100 apples, right? But in the auditing world, we cannot sit there and live with testing 100%. So we have to live with some sampling risk, okay? So we will go ahead and set our risk of assessing control risk too low. And what? The lower we set that, the bigger the sample. The higher we set that, the smaller the sample. Inverse relationship, okay? Now, when you see this, often we'll say, okay, we'll take a 5% risk of assessing control risk too low. That means we want to be 95% sure that we are correct. So we often call that confidence level. So we'll take 1 minus 5%. Okay, 5% chance that we will draw the wrong conclusion, meaning we want to have what? A 95% confidence level. Now, what happens if we wanted to get that risk of assessing control risk even lower? What do you think a good percentage would be for the risk of assessing control risk too low? We want to get this risk lower. What would be a lower number here?
98%.
Huh?
98%.
So you're saying you are going to get your risk, that doesn't look right, that's 2%. Those are percentages. Okay. So now you're saying that you only want a 2% risk of assessing control risk too low, right?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying, Timmy? Because if we took 1 minus 2%, good, then that would equal what? Well, you were saying a 98% confidence level, right? Okay, good. Which one's going to give you the bigger sample size, the 95 or the 98?
I would think that the 98 is going to give you a bigger sample
Good.
size.
Inverse relationship, what? The lower we're trying to get that risk of assessing control is too low, the larger the sample size, right? And the more our confidence. Okay. If you wanted 100% confidence level, then you can't no samples. You have to test all of them, right? Okay. Question? Okay, good. Tolerable deviation rate. And for tolerable deviation rate, we say that there is an inverse relationship. Again, an inverse relationship, meaning that if I'm willing to accept greater risk, I can have a smaller sample size, or if I want less risk, then I'm going to have a size.
Hi, sir. I'm here. Professor,
Uh-huh.
I'm here. I just
Okay.
checked in.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We're on page 77, I guess. Okay. All right, good. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at our this notion here. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this in. Guys, this is not from standard anywhere. This is just some stuff. You see these books behind me, and one of these stupid books back here had an example, something like this, but it's not from standard. Okay, it's just sort of a guideline that I saw in some literature, but it helps illustrate how this tolerable deviation rate works. Okay, so if I set my control risk at, say, low, okay, that means that I think that control works pretty well. And if I think that control works pretty well, do you think I want it to have operating effectiveness most of the time?
Yes.
Yeah. So my tolerable deviation rate is probably 0 to 3%. Now, again, this is not standard. Don't say, oh, they're going to ask me, 0 to 3%. They're not going to ask you that, but it's going to be a pretty low tolerable deviation rate. I'm going to expect that control to work most of the time. Okay. So if my tolerable deviation rate is 0 to 3%, then my sample size for my control testing is going to be larger. Because I really, really want to look at enough transactions, right, to be pretty darn sure, 95% confident level, right? And I'm going to look at enough items here to really, really help me to make sure that that control is working. Okay. Now let's say I set my control risk as moderate. Well, now I'm sitting here and I'm saying, well, it's not as critical of a control. The control risk is at moderate. So I'll go ahead and I'll accept a little more deviation. I'll accept deviation. And again, this is not written in standard. Again, this book that I have back here somewhere sat there and suggested that a 4 to 7% tolerable deviation would be consistent with a moderate assessment of control risk. And so now I can probably have a smaller sample size for my control testing. I can just put smaller because I already have sample sizes, the column heading. Okay. Now, if I set my control risk at high, that means that I'm thinking the deviation rate is pretty high. Okay. So what do you think my sample size should be now?
Like 8 to 12 or something.
I didn't ask what my tolerable deviation rate should be. These are not sample sizes. These are deviation rates here. When we got to sample size, I simply said larger versus smaller. What do you think my sample size should be here if I have a control risk at high? The sample size for my control testing.
Relatively smaller than moderate?
No. If you assess your control risk at high, how big is your sample for your control testing?
I would say you probably shouldn't test controls.
Correct. You don't test controls. Very good. Right? If I'm sitting there and I'm telling you, if I assess my control risk at high, my risk of material misstatement is high, what do? I bypass the testing of the operating effectiveness controls and I do what? I go straight to my substantive testing. So tolerable deviation rate becomes non-applicable here. It's simply, hey, you've assessed your control risk at high, do not take don't do your control testing. Okay, so again, inverse relationship between what? Between my tolerable deviation rate and my sample size. Okay, okay, good. Now, expected deviation rate, they tell us that there is a direct relationship. Okay, so what happens? If I have a client that consistently, year to year, applies their controls effectively, then I can use my previous knowledge. Now we're using knowledge from previous audits to sit there and say, you know, okay, I've had previous experience with this client. I don't have to ignore that previous experience. So my expected deviation rate is lower. So my sample size can be lower. If I have a client that's consistently messing up on the controls, I'm like, okay, they still don't get it. Let me pull a larger sample and make sure that things are working, even if they tell me when I walk in, because sometimes you walk in the second year of an audit and the client says, oh, we got it now. We signed all the time. You're going to be so proud of us. What do? That does not affect your expected deviation rate. What do? You still pull a big sample and look. And let's say that year, hey, they got it. They did it, right? Then what? I would still stick with the same expected deviation rate in year 3 with that client. See if they get it when they're not paying as much attention and not trying to impress us, right? And after that 3rd year, if they start doing the control appropriately, then maybe I can bring down that expected deviation rate, bring down my sample size for my control testing. Okay, question? Okay, and then finally, you can flashcard here that for our attribute testing, population really does not have an effect on sample size for relatively large populations, meaning those that are greater than 5,000. Okay, all right, guys, got to flashcard that, got to understand that. Lots of questions that ask you, you know, how these different things affect sample size. What is this? This doesn't look right. Something's wrong. Is this looking like your book? What am I missing?
Yeah, I'm seeing that.
Yeah, I
Oh.
see that.
Okay, sorry. Okay, good. I was on the wrong page. You're okay. Okay, we're okay. All right, so let's just go ahead and let's take a look over here. And now we're going to use some actual numbers to see how these different factors affect sample size, okay? So they tell us, assume the auditor is testing the sales orders, okay? And assume the auditor is willing to accept 5% risk of assessing control risk too low. The auditor expects a deviation of 1% and a tolerable deviation rate of 6%. Okay, so they're using those factors. Again, the population size they don't talk about because it really doesn't affect sample size for this example here, right? Okay, and so what happens? First of all, I've got to make sure that I'm on the 5% risk of assessing control risk too low table. Now be careful on the exam. They could call this what? The 95% confidence level. That would be synonymous with what? 5% risk of assessing control risk too low. So on the exam, they may give you a couple of different tables. And if it tells you 5% risk of assessing control risk too low, you know you have to go to the 95% confidence level table, not the 90%, not the 10% risk of assessing control risk too low, right? They gave you a couple of different tables. Then we look and this is the only table Becker gave us here, right? So we know we have to go to this table. But then they told us that the expected deviation rate is 1% and the tolerable deviation rate is 6%. So I bring my finger along the 1% expected deviation rate row, the 6% column, and my sample size is 78, right? Okay, good. Then they start playing with some of these parameters a little bit and want to see if we can figure out what's going to happen to the sample size. So would sample size increase or decrease if the expected deviation rate decreased to 0%? So now I'm looking and I'm saying, hey, I've got a client that's pretty good. And of course, I only have this one table to work with, but we're still at the 95% confidence level or 5% risk of assessing control risk too low. I come up at the 6%, right, tolerable rate, and the sample size does what? It decreases to 49. Okay, so what we said is correct. As your expected deviation rate goes down, your sample size comes down. Direct relationship, right? Okay. Number 3, would the sample size increase or decrease if the tolerable, would the sample size increase or decrease if the tolerable deviation rate increased to 7%? So now, just sticking at the 1% expected deviation rate, if I go from 6 to 7, the sample size indeed does come down, because if I'm willing to accept more deviation from this sample, I must not think this control is nearly as critical, and so I can look at less items, right? Question? Okay, good. And then number 4, would sample size increase or decrease if the risk of assessing control risk too low increased to 10%? Now, I can't look at the table for this answer because what? This is the 5% table, but what do you think?
It would decrease.
Good. Sample size is going to decrease. Very good. And it's going to decrease because what? I'm taking a bigger chance. Now I'm willing to accept a 10% chance that I'll get the incorrect conclusion, right? I'm only going to be 90% confident in my conclusions. Okay? Okay, good. Very good. Now we come over and let's take a look. And let's take a look at the selecting the sample. And as we said last time, you use random sampling techniques. Random sampling techniques, got to use those. Okay, so you pull the sample and then you evaluate the sample. Now, they give us some rules here, some reminders for evaluating the sample, and we're going to use table 2 on the next page. Or is it down there? Yeah, the next page, I think. Yeah, table 2 on the next page, we'll come to that in a minute, to look and determine something called the upper deviation rate. Now, when you look, make sure that you evaluate the sample on the 5% table. If they tell you that the sample size was determined at the 95% confidence level at the 5% risk of assessing control risk too low, when you go to the evaluation table, you have to make sure and use the 5% table, okay? Locate the sample size and number of deviations found in the sample, and the number at the intersection is something called the upper deviation rate, okay? Now, the upper deviation rate has something in there called an allowance, which is a cushion, allowance for sampling risk, which is a cushion against undetected deviations, okay? Now, I'm going to come back and use this formula again for you in a minute, but it is something you're gonna have to flashcard, okay? So let's just come over and let's take a look at this example, okay? And they tell us that we have what? We have 1 sales order out of 100. And by the way, guys, they kind of abandoned the example because in our example, our sample size was 78, whatever. Now they're saying, okay, forget what we just told you about the sample size. Now just pretend that the sample size was 100, okay? And so what happens? If we find 1 out of 100 that doesn't have the credit approval, what's my deviation rate? Not a trick question.
1%.
Good. I have a 1% deviation rate. Good, excellent, okay? Now I use the table to determine the upper deviation rate, okay? I'm on the right table. On the exam, they might give me the 10% table, 5% table. I'd have to know what my risk of assessing control risk too low was to be able to, you know, make this conclusion, right? So now I come over and I find the actual number of deviations, which was 1. I find my sample size, and they're telling me, hey, the deviation rate on this could be as high as 4.7%. Okay, so my upper deviation rate here is what? 4.7%. And you look at that and you say, well, wait a minute, John, we only had 1 out of 100. Why are we going up and saying it could be as high as 4.7%? Because this is a sample. And there's always a chance that the sample will give different results than what the true value of the population is. And so we give ourselves an allowance for sampling risk, a cushion. This is often sometimes called precision. And you see precision talked about in sampling a lot, in which they sit there and they say, plus or minus 3%, whatever, right? And when you look at that during the elections and stuff, it means one candidate could have 3% more or 3% less. The other candidate could have 3% more or 3% less. So generally, precision is talked about in plus or minuses. In auditing, we only care how high the deviation rate can go. If it's lower, fine. That's good for us, but we want to see how high it can go, because if it goes too high, then we're going to determine that the control does not have operating effectiveness. So we only look at the upper end of the precision, which is 4.7%. So then they ask us, well, what is the allowance for sampling risk? And if the upper deviation rate, if this table is telling me, hey, dude, it could go what? As high as 4.7%. And the actual deviation rate was 1%. My percentages are looking kind of funky today. Okay, it's only 1%. Then that means I have a what? I have a cushion. I have an allowance for sampling risk of what? 3.7%. And I put that cushion there just in case what? Just in case there's more items in there than I was detecting through my control testing here. Now, is an auditor ever 100% sure of anything?
No.
No. So we know that the auditor is what? We were at the 95% confidence level. We are scientists. We don't sit here and just say, well, it's always going to be this. You know, we're not like some politicians will say, make dogmatic statements because they know nobody's paying attention, right? As a scientist, we say the auditor is 95% sure that the true deviation rate does not exceed what? Does not exceed 4.7%. Even then, we give ourselves some doubt there, 5%. In this case. Okay. Question? Okay, good. Now that we have that upper deviation rate, we can form a conclusion based on what we see when we look at oh, I promised you I'd come back to this formula before we go to that. Just come back to this formula, because I thought it's worthwhile to just put in the numbers from our example. Our sample deviation rate in that little example was what? 1%. We added the allowance for sampling risk, which was 3.7%. That yielded us the upper deviation rate of 4.7%. Now, the problem that I have with that flashcard suggestion there is that, you know, they don't have to, the way it really kind of works is what? You pull from the table what your upper deviation rate is, you know what your actual deviation rate is, and what they asked you to calculate the cushion, which was the allowance for sampling risk. Okay, so that's probably another way to flashcard that formula. Okay, good. Now you come over and let's look at form the conclusion. And now we say if the upper deviation rate is equal to or less than the auditor's tolerable rate, the auditor may rely on the control, right? Because we didn't exceed our tolerable deviation rate. If the upper deviation rate exceeds the tolerable rate, then the auditor is going to look for another control that'll compensate for the control that just failed the operating effectiveness test, or probably going to be more the case, the auditor will modify the timing, extent, and nature of your substantive procedures. Nature, going to use external evidence instead of internal evidence. Extent, Larger sample sizes, timing, going to probably have to do some more year-end testing. Okay. Okay, good. So go ahead and flashcard how the auditor would respond if the sample indicates that the control does not have operating effectiveness, because the tolerable deviation rate exceeds the upper deviation rate, exceeds the tolerable deviation rate. Okay, good. Now you come over and form a conclusion based on this example. And they say, hey, we have an upper deviation rate of 4.7. If tolerable rate is 3%, the auditor is not going to believe that that control has operating effectiveness. They're going to be sad, and they're going to have to go and do the full measure of the substantive test, or scrounge around for some other control that will compensate for the one that just failed. Okay. And now they kept the upper deviation rate here at 4.7, but now they say, well, what happens if the tolerable deviation rate was not 3%, but 6%? Well, now the auditor is happy. That's supposed to be a happy auditor. Yes, I can rely on the control. Question? And of course, you always have to document. Now they talk about a couple of other lightly tested attribute sampling models here. One is called discovery sampling. Discovery sampling should be used if we think that there should be a low or zero deviation rate. So we're looking to see if we see indications of fraud. So we would expect to never find the deviation. And then if we do, then the auditor would then be able to say, I believe that this potential for fraud occurred, 1% of the time, and I'm 95% confident in that decision. Okay, so you may be able to give some comfort level to a client. You never tell your client, hey, I looked at the transactions and I didn't find any indications of fraud, so you don't have fraud. You would go to the client and you say, well, I'm 95% certain that this didn't happen. If you think this is indicative of fraud management, I'm 95% certain that this didn't happen more than 1% of the time. And then management decides what that means. I mean, management could use something like that to say, aha, I always wanted to fire that person. Well, wait a minute. I don't know where you're coming from that, because I didn't find any deviations, but I can't sit here and tell you it never happened, because I can't give you, 100% conclusions like that. I'll tell you, I'm 95% sure that did not happen more than 1% of the time, and you're going to have to live with that, right? Okay. Okay, good. So that's what we say here, if no deviations. That's why they call it discovery sampling. You're looking to see if you see the weird thing. Now, if you see the weird thing, that you weren't expecting, like let's say the cashier wrote a check to themselves, well, then you're going to probably expand the sample and really try to get behind how pervasive that problem is. Okay, so it's just seeing if anything weird occurred. Okay, now with stop or go sampling is really used to avoid oversampling. Okay, so with stop or go sampling, as soon as you find the deviation, you stop looking at the sample items. So you set your sample up in such a way that as soon as you find the deviation, you stop going through your sample items. Now, it would be sad if you had a sample of 100 and you found the deviation on the 100th item. You're hoping to run into that a little sooner along so that you can stop your sampling procedure and then make your decisions from there. Okay, all right, good. Let's go ahead and let's take a look then at our couple questions for tonight. Okay, good. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at this question. So make your best selection, okay? And most of us got it right. Okay, good. Okay, so 91% of us. And that what? When we're looking at attribute sampling, okay, we are doing what? We are doing a test of control. And these other A, C, and D, the wrong answers were all what? A substantive type test, looking at dollar amounts, okay, and confirming accounts receivable, making an estimate of the amount of LIFO inventory, examining invoices for the valuation assertion, okay? When we're looking for an attribute, we're looking to see if a control was applied. For example, was the time card what approved by supervisor? The attribute is like, hey, what attribute do you have? Do you have short hair, long hair, blue, blue hair, green hair, red hair, whatever? Okay, this is all going to be attribute. So we're looking to see if a transaction contains the attribute, which is the approval by the supervisor here. Okay. All right, good work. Let's take a look at this next one. Don't read the first choice and pick the first choice. There is no way that you could have read through all those choices, understood that question in less than 20 seconds. Stop doing that. Get out of that habit. I'm going to keep hitting you on that. Keep doing that. I'm going to keep hitting you on that. That is a horrible habit to get in.
That wasn't me this time, but sometimes I do that because I read ahead because I'm waiting on answer one to come up and I have extra time. But I can see why you wouldn't want us to do that.
Well, I wouldn't get as pissed if the person didn't select the wrong answer.
That's fair. But yeah, I should probably wait until you go over the answers.
Okay. Okay, I'm giving you a little more time on this one. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, good. And okay, 73% for a question like this is pretty good. This is a little bit of a tougher question. So let's go through this one together. Okay, now we look and we say, as a result of test of controls, an auditor assessed control risk too low. Now, let me ask you, is this a mistake that's made by the auditor? If you're watching the basketball game and Stephen Curry shoots the ball and the ball goes under the basket. Did Curry make a mistake?
That will never happen.
It will if
Might
you get,
happen when he's 85. Did he make a mistake?
yes.
Yeah, okay, you went too low. That's a mistake. So the auditor made a mistake, didn't they? Okay, and as a result, huh?
No, I was agreeing with you. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, good. The auditor made a mistake. And they, as a result of that, made the mistake of decreasing substantive testing. Why did this mistake happen? Now, let's look at it from this standpoint for a second. Let's say we have, what's this? We have a barrel of apples, right? And we have the auditor. Made my barrel too big, but that's okay. I have the auditor here. And the auditor did what? The auditor tested 4 of these 5 apples, and they all came back that there was no poison. Okay, so what's the deviation rate in the sample?
One out of 5, which is what, 20%?
No, deviation rate. The auditor is looking to see if there's poison apples. The auditor tested how many apples in the sample?
4,
And how many were poison?
0.
0. So the sample deviation rate was what?
0%.
0%. Now I think you know what's going to happen. The auditor ate the 5th apple and died. Why did this happen? Their hat fell off and everything. Why did this happen?
Because he made a mistake.
He made a mistake because what? The true deviation rate in the sample was not, in the population was not 0% like it was in the sample. It was what?
1 out of 5.
It was 20%, wasn't it?
20%, yes.
So this mistake happened because what? This assessment occurred because the true deviation rate in the population was more than the deviation rate in the sample, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. Good. Most of you got that one right. That's a tougher question, but you got to kind of get used to that way of reading those questions and thinking through that process. That's why I got upset when somebody I thought picked too soon. Maybe they had been looking at that question beforehand. Less than the risk of assessing controlled risk too low. I don't get the, some of these answers to me, like, guys, sound like a drunk auditor. Why did you do that? Well, because the assessment occurred because the true deviation rate in the population was less than the risk of assessing control just too low based on the sample size. I'd say, Turner, if I was a police officer, I'd say, turn around, sir. Okay, we're gonna take you away if you start talking like that. All right, let's take a look at number 3. I'll put the poll up. Okay, let's go ahead and let's take a look at this one. And okay, we're surprisingly low on this one because I figured this one would be a 90%er. Most of us got it right, but I'm surprised. I thought we'd get a higher percentage than that. Okay, so let me get that out of the way. Although I think I always clear it out of the way, but then I think in the recording it doesn't show up anyway, right? Okay, but you know, the answer is C, the risk of incorrect rejection. So what happens? Let's say you've got these two people that you can choose to have as your life partner. Okay, now you reject this person, and meanwhile you accept this person. These are people. Okay, now this person goes on to become a crook. This person goes on to become, you know, a millionaire, wonderful person. This person turns out to be actually, you know, the right person, the one you should have married. You just suffered what? The risk of incorrect rejection. You rejected the wrong person. Okay, you said, hey, you're not the right person for me, when in fact, they were the right person for you. You should have picked that person. You incorrectly rejected that person. Okay. So while performing test of details during an audit, the auditor determined from sample results support the conclusion the account balance was materially misstated. If you think it's materially misstated, you're going to give what? An qualified adverse opinion, whatever, right? It in fact was not materially misstated. You did what? You incorrectly rejected those financial statements. You should have accepted them. You should have said unmodified opinion, unqualified. Okay. All right. Now you look at these questions that we've looked at here, and notice, guys, there's a single number in these questions. Okay. So when you're looking at audit sampling, you're thinking, oh, statistics and crunching numbers and whatnot. And it's what? It's largely definitional. We have a flashcard on these definitions. You're going to have to get comfortable with these definitions, know what these things mean to be able to get the, you know, 5 points that you'll see in audit sampling. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and let's try one more. Actually, let's do this one together. This one's a little tougher. You want to do it on your own? You want to do it together?
I wouldn't mind trying my own.
Okay, I'll let you do it on your own. Then we'll do it together. After you screw it up, we'll do it together. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead and we'll go through it together after you've had a chance. Okay, let's go ahead and end the poll here. Make your best shot. Okay. And when I worked for GAO, the Government Accountability Office, in order to get your CPA in those days, you had to demonstrate that you could pretty much audit an entity on your own. So I got assigned the audit of the House of Representatives Child Care Center, $150,000 asset entity, small enough one person could do the entire audit pretty much on their own. But of course I had a supervisor. And so I sat down and I started asking my supervisor, this guy, Jack Erlin, kind of an old rough around the edges guy, you know, different questions about things that I'm thinking about doing on the audit. And finally he stops me and he says, it's your assignment, fuck it up if you want to. Okay, this is what he told me. So now as the years went on, I started to realize that I was starting to be a guy that was actually starting to really do things by the standards and whatnot. And, you know, a lot of those guys didn't even know what the hell I was talking about. I'm saying, I'm going to assess the risk material misstatement the maximum. And, you know, is this okay? And fuck it up if you want to. Okay. So, you did this question on your own and we can see we're all over the place. 45% of us got it right, but let's go through it together so that you kind of see how we got to D, okay? And this a strategy for getting to the right answer. So an auditor who uses statistical sampling for attributes in testing controls should reduce the planned reliance on the prescribed control. Now, the first thing you think to yourself is, well, when would I not want to rely on the control? Anybody got an answer for me? When would you decide not to rely on the control? And speak to me in audit language.
If control risk is high.
Okay, but if I'm using sampling, how would I determine the control risk is high? If I've gone ahead and I've tested the operating effectiveness and I got some result that told me control risk is high, I should not rely on that control. What would indicate to me that the control risk was high after I've done the testing?
Your deviation rate is greater than the tolerable rate.
Okay, close, very good. My what? My upper deviation rate, okay, using the correct terminology, my upper deviation rate. Deviation rate doesn't allow the cushion for the allowance for sampling risk. So I raise the hurdle even more by allowing that allowance for sampling risk. We call that what? The upper deviation rate. So the upper deviation rate says 4.7%. Good. And Christian, so in that example, my what? Tolerable deviation rate, I'm just going to say, it's, you said it's less, right? So it must be, I'm just going to say 3%, right?
I'm following.
Okay. Okay, good. So what happens? Well, how do I determine the upper deviation rate? Well, the upper deviation rate is what? Is the deviation rate plus the allowance for sampling risk, isn't it? In our little example, the deviation rate was 1% and the allowance for sampling risk was what, 3.7%? That was how we got that upper deviation rate. Okay, so the auditor would not rely on the control if what? The sample rate of deviation plus the allowance for sampling risk exceeded the tolerable rate, right? Hello?
Yeah, I'm trying to
Yeah.
wrap my brain around it all.
That was our example. upper deviation rate, we compared it to tolerable rate. We said, no, don't rely. If your tolerable rate was 3%, upper deviation rate was 4.7%. We know we can't rely on the control in that situation. And then all this was doing was what? Expecting us to know what constituted the upper deviation rate, which is deviation rate plus the allowance for sampling risk, right?
All right.
Okay. Again, I use numbers to explain this, but completely definitional question. Okay. Question? Okay, let's go ahead and let's take a quick break. We'll take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 6:30 and we'll pick up with module 9. I'm going to pause the recording, so when we come back, somebody please remind me to start it again, okay? Recording. And let's go ahead and start to take a look at our discussion now for, they're calling it sampling part 2. It's really looking at substantive testing using sampling, and we're going to look at variable sampling first, which is sort of the more classic way of doing sampling. And then we will also look at probability proportionate to size, which frankly is really the state of the art, almost the way everyone does their sampling these days. But the exam could ask us some questions about variable sampling, so we don't want to ignore that, okay? So we're going to, again, talk about some planning considerations, and we're going to talk about tolerable misstatement. So just like tolerable deviation rate was the maximum rate of deviation that the auditor would accept and still believe that the control has operating effectiveness, now tolerable misstatement is saying when you apply sampling, you're going to come up with a tolerable misstatement, and that's the maximum amount of misstatement you will accept without believing that the population is materially misstated. Remember, we defined that back in chapter 2 when we said that tolerable misstatement is basically our materiality being applied to a sampling procedure. We said that back in chapter 2. Now you come over and you take a look at the next page, and we say that when you look, you have your projected misstatement versus your tolerable misstatement. Now, your projected misstatement is your projection of your misstatement based on the sample. You'll compare your projected misstatement to your tolerable misstatement, which you came up with by applying your, remember, we had the overall financial statement materiality, and then we had a performance materiality that was less than our overall financial statement materiality. We said this back in chapter 2, but then if we're applying sampling, we simply call that projected, a tolerable misstatement. And we're going to compare our projected misstatement to that tolerable misstatement that we came up with going through that process that we talked about in chapter 2. Okay, now, how then do you come up with this projected misstatement? Okay, and using variables sampling plans, there are 3 methods that the exam talks to us about: mean per unit, okay, and then on the next page we'll talk about ratio versus difference estimation. Now, for the most part, questions here really deal with, do you understand what these different variable sampling plans allow an auditor to do? So that's really what we're going to focus on here. And flashcard what is unique about these different sampling plans. And then a little bit later, we're going to look at an example that will actually show how numbers will be used for these 3 different plans. You might have 1 or 2 questions that might expect you to use a numerical analysis for one of these questions. But for the most part, I want you to make sure that you're comfortable with what these plans, what's special about them, okay? So mean per unit is a sampling plan that uses the average value of items in the sample to estimate the true population value, okay? Now, this is the part I want you to flashcard right here. The mean per unit method does not require the book value of the population to estimate the true population value. Just go ahead and flashcard that. We're going to look at the example here in a little while. And then when you look back at this and make the flashcard, you'll remember that example and how the example illustrated what's special about first mean per unit. Then we're going to go over to ratio estimation. Okay. Ratio estimation, a sample plan that uses the ratio of audited correct values to their book values to project the population value. Okay, well, what's special about ratio estimation? Here comes our flashcard. Ratio estimation is a highly efficient technique when calculated audit values are approximately proportional to the client's book value amounts, meaning there's not a lot of misstatement there. You can use ratio estimation. Flashcard that. Difference estimation. Difference estimation, sample plan that uses the average difference between the audited, which are the correct values. Once we've audited something and we come up with the correct value through our audit process, then for difference estimation, we would compare that to the book values. And they tell us that difference estimation is used instead of ratio estimation when the differences are not proportionate. So if you have the difference versus ratio, you would use difference if you believe that your misstatement is a little higher. Okay. Okay, good. Flashcard, what we say that is special about those three methods. I'm going to come back to the sample size factors here because that's probably the more important thing. But I do want to go ahead and spend a little time with this example so you can see the application of the three methods that we just talked about. And I'll come back up to the sample size factors here in a second. Okay, so mean per unit. Okay, and mean per unit, we take what? We take the average sample value. Let's just read this. I think it's worthwhile to help understand. So assume the form that from a population of 5,000 accounts with a total of 4,500,000, that's the book value. The auditor selected a sample of 200 accounts with a total book value of 184,000. We sent out confirmations and the confirmations came back and hey, there were some misstatements. So the confirmation resulted in audit values of 170,000 with an average audited value of 875. That's 175,000 divided by the 200 accounts that we sent out for confirmation. As we said, for mean per unit, we would take that average audit value, multiply it by the number of total accounts, not the number of items in the sample, but the number of total accounts, and this would give us a point estimate. We would then compare that point estimate to the recorded value and see if we have a misstatement that is in excess of our tolerable misstatement. If we do, we would ask for an adjustment. Okay. Now, we could also use ratio estimation. Ratio estimation takes the audited values to the book values, multiplies that times what? Times the total. And here we do need to know the book value. Notice that for mean per unit, we didn't care what the book value was. We just simply came up with a point estimate, and then we were going to compare that to the book value to see if we had a material misstatement, but we didn't have to use the book values of any of our audited items. Here we do use the audited value versus we didn't use the book value for any of our audited items in mean per unit. Here for ratio estimation, we will use the book value of those audited items to come up with a ratio. We multiply that times the book value, and that's how we come up with our point estimate. And again, we go through the process of comparing that to our tolerable misstatement to see if we think we need an adjustment. Difference estimation, we take what? We take the book value versus the audited value. We divide that by the items in the sample, and that gives us now an error per unit. We multiply that by the number of units in the entire population, and that gives us what? A projected error for that population. And then to come up with the point estimate, since this was an understatement, we would take that point estimate, subtract it from the book value, take that the the book value, subtract the projected error to come up with our point estimate, I should say. Okay. Now, what would happen if they told you, instead of told you the 200 and instead of telling you the 5,000, what would happen if they simply told you, hey, you looked at 4% of the population? Could you still use difference estimation here? And I would say you could, because what you would say is, look, I'm sitting here and I have $9,200 is the difference between my audited values and my book values. I've looked at what? 4% of the population. So that means, not times here, but equals. That means that what, 9,200 represents 4% of the what, projected error, doesn't it? And then if you just go ahead and do the algebra on that, 9,200 divided by 0.04 would give you what? Would also give you that projected error. Now you're saying, well, John, why are you pointing that out to me? Because there's an exam question, okay, that has the multiple choice question 02585, 02585, in which that's exactly what that question did. Okay, so let's just go ahead. We don't do a lot of this in class, unfortunately, because you can see we're really pressed for time, but I want to go ahead and let's do that for this particular one. Okay, so I'm going to go over and I'm going to be spying on you pretty soon. I have received my exam scores for that, but that was a long, long time ago. Okay, and what I want to do is find that question. Okay, and I'm going to be going in pretty quickly here and looking to see that you've done your homework. So if you have been remiss in doing your homework, I get real busy pretty quickly. Okay, I want to at least see that you've done some work on your homework. Okay, all right, good. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this question. Okay, and they tell us here that the auditor established a $60,000 tolerable misstatement for an asset with an account balance of $1 million. The auditor selected a sample of every 20th item from the population that represents the asset account balance and discovered overstatements of 3,700 and understatements of 200. Under these circumstances, what should the auditor do? So here we go. We're sitting here and we're seeing that they are giving me a difference estimation technique here, even though they didn't call it out as such, okay? But they're not telling me the total size of the population. They're not telling me the total sample size. They do tell me, however, that what? That we looked at every 20th item. Okay, so if I'm looking at this one now, go ahead and see if I can get a new whiteboard. Okay, if I'm looking at this, if I've looked at every 20th item, and guys, my writing's going to look worse than ever because of the fact that I'm not in tablet mode. 1 out of 20 means I've looked at what? 1 divided by 20 is caught you, busted you, not paying attention. 1 divided by 20 is what?
5%.
5%. Okay, good. So I've looked at what, 5% of this population, okay? And so what they're sitting here is they're telling me is what? 0.05 times the projected error is going to equal the difference between the audited values and the book values, even though they didn't call it difference estimation, that's what they meant here. And so I go ahead and I take a look, and what? I had overstatements of 3,700 and understatements of 200. So that's a net, what? Misstatement of 3,500. So I'm going to take that 3,500 now, and I'm going to divide both sides by 0.05. I'm going to divide it by 0.05. That's going to give me the projected error just doing the algebra here. What does that come out to? I'll wait.
70,000.
Good. That comes out to 70,000. So I've got a projected error here of 70,000. Now going back to the question now, I have a tolerable misstatement of 60,000. Is this auditor happy?
No.
No, I'm not happy here. So I look, and A says there's an unacceptably high risk that the actual misstatements exceeds a tolerable misstatement. Yeah, my projected error is 70,000 and my tolerable error was what? Was 70,000. So yeah, I'm not happy. There's a what? Unexpected, there's an unacceptably high risk that actual misstatement exceed the tolerable misstatement. Question? Okay, good. Now we go back to the text, and I'm going to go back to those sample size things, but let's just finish up this discussion here on, what then the auditor's conclusions would be. And it really flows from that question that we just looked at, okay, using the, what am I looking for here? Using, in that example, and by the way, they didn't call it out as difference estimation, but that's what it was. In using the methods, mean per unit, ratio estimation, difference estimation, in deciding whether to accept the client's book value, the auditor determines whether the recorded book value falls within an acceptable range, which is a point estimate. And again, we bring in that allowance for sampling risk. And if it falls within the tolerable misstatement, the auditor would accept the account balance. If not, the auditor is going to say, hey, I need an adjustment because there's an unacceptably high risk that my projected misstatement is exceeding my tolerable misstatement. Okay. Okay. And of course, you have to document the sampling procedure. Now, before we turn our attention to the discussion of dollar unit sampling, let's just take a look at how these different factors will affect sample size, because I want you to flashcard this because they will be asking you questions like this, okay? So the auditor uses the following parameters to determine sample size, okay? And they tell us that we have tolerable misstatement, expected misstatement, and acceptable level of risk, which is the acceptable level of risk of incorrect acceptance and risk of incorrect rejection. Okay, now let's see how these affect sample size. Okay, so let's just take a look. Sample size will increase as the following increase, which is a direct relationship. Okay, expected misstatement, you're going to do what? You're going to have a larger sample size for your substantive testing. Variability in the population, standard deviation, More standard deviation, you need a larger sample size. Assess level of risk, you need a larger sample size. In other words, guys, all they're saying here for your expected misstatement, your assessed level of risk is what? My RMM, my risk of material misstatement, is being driven up by these assessed risks. That means my detection risk has to come down. That means what goes up? Substantive testing. And when we talk about substantive testing, we talk about what? Nature. And this is affecting what? Extent and timing. So again, you look at how these different variables are affecting your sample size, is driving it up, okay? Sample size will decrease, okay, as the following increase, inverse relationship. So what happens? As your tolerable misstatement comes down, that's in effect saying that your materiality is being squeezed. And so what are you gonna have to have? A larger sample size to make sure you find all those errors, right? As the acceptable level of risk comes down. So now what? Now we're talking about the risk of incorrect acceptance, the risk of incorrect rejection. If you want to avoid that mistake, what do? You're going to have a larger sample size. Okay, so flashcard, how those different factors affect the sample size. All right. Okay, good. Let's go ahead then and let's turn our attention to PPS. Probability proportion to size is sometimes also called dollar unit sampling, okay? Now, what happens? Dollar unit sampling. Why would they call probability proportion to size dollar unit sampling? So let's say I have a client and the client has $500,000 of accounts receivable. Okay, now everyone in the class here represents one of my client's customers. Okay, and each one of you have so many dollar bills sitting in front of you that represent the money that you owe to my client. Okay, now I go ahead and I say, okay, I'm gonna pick every $5,000. So I go around the class and I start with Joseph. And I say, Joseph, you have $300 sitting in front of you that represents money that you owe to my client, that is receivable to my client, okay? Joseph, can you possibly have my $5,000 if you only have $3,000 sitting in front of you?
Possible.
How?
Well, you're saying it's just the I can't say that word, $1,000.
$5,000. I start with you, you only have $300 sitting in front of you.
Well, if you just give me a sample of the 5,000, then it's a 1 in 5,000 chance to have that $5,000.
So I'm going to look at your first dollar, your second dollar, your third dollar, your fourth dollar, your $299, your $300. Will you have the $5,000?
Possibly.
I'm looking at every $5,000. The answer is no, because you only have $300. So I can't get to the $5,000 by looking at your dollars.
Okay, I
You
misunderstood
had
that.
500. So now I'm going to go to the next person. I'm going to go to Julia. And Julia, you have, so Joseph had $500 sitting in front of him. Julia, you have $3,000. Do you have my $5,000?
No.
No, I went to 5 plus 3. That's what? 3,500. So no, Julie doesn't have it either. Okay, good. Now I've looked at what, $3,500 so far. So I go to the next person. I go to Matthew, and Matthew, you have $4,000 sitting in front of you. Do you have my 5,000?
Yes.
Yes, because now I've looked at what, 3,500, and what, after I look at 500 of your dollars, I found my $5,000, right? So what do? I send out a confirmation to Matthew here, asking him to confirm the entire balance, but really I'm confirming what? That first $5,000. Now, if I'm looking at every $5,000, then my next dollar I'm looking for is what?
Dollar number 10,000. Is that what
Good.
you're looking for?
Looking for my $10,000. Excellent. So I go to Amra now, and Amra, you have sitting in front of you $7,000. Do you have my? In fact, you've been doing a lot of shopping here, so you have $9,000 sitting in front of you. Do you have my $10,000?
No.
Well, Matthew, how many did you have?
I think I had 4,000.
You had 4,000. How many did you have, Julia?
25.
I think
Oh,
by
I have.
me the total was 7,500.
Forget the example. Okay, let's just look at the book. Okay, because now I can't remember. And I thought you guys would remember the dollars you had, and I can't remember, and we're wasting time. Okay, so let's just look at PPS sampling. Okay, advantages of PPS sampling. It automatically emphasizes larger items. So the more dollars you have sitting in front of you, the more likely it is that that particular account will be selected. So it automatically emphasizes larger items to be selected. Now they tell us that a disadvantage, okay, of PPS sampling is accounts with zero or negative balances will not have an equal chance of being selected, because if you have no dollars in front of you, then your account is not going to be selected. Now you can design around that. I would tell you that if you have accounts receivable with zero balances, if you have a lot of them, then you can take a random sample of those zeros, and any account receivable with a negative balance needs to be looked at, because if it truly is negative, then it shouldn't even be listed as an asset. It needs to be listed as a liability. That becomes a classification issue. Okay. All right, good. Now, as you look at the sample size determination to come up with that sampling interval, you're going to take your tolerable misstatement and you're going to divide it by something called a reliability factor. And then your sample size is going to be your sample interval that you just calculated above, divided by the recorded amount of the population. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's just take a look at how we determine sample size here. Okay, and we have these different risk of incorrect acceptance factors. Okay, that means we're going to give the incorrect opinion, and then we go ahead and some genius, I don't mean Becker, I mean just some genius in general, figured out reliability factors that are associated with different risks of incorrect acceptance. Okay, so what happens if our risk of incorrect acceptance, meaning we're wanting to be 95% sure we don't incorrectly accept these financial statements, in other words, only 5% chance we'll give the wrong opinion, and they tell us that the tolerable misstatement is 15, following that formula on the other page, our sampling interval is 5,000. Then what? Then to determine the sample size, as we saw from those flashcards with the formula, we'll take the 500,000, the recorded value, and we will go ahead and divide that by the sampling interval. So our sample size is 100. Okay. Now you come over, and now we are going to select our sample, but we must start with what? With a random number. So we go to our random number generator, and our random number generator says that our random start is 300. Okay, so first we're going to look for our $300. So we go to the account receivable number 1. It's only got $150 in it. It can't have the $300 because it's not big enough. There's not $300 there. So I go to account number 2. I add in that 800, that brings me up to 950. So now I have what? Now I have found my $300. Now I go ahead and I get on my sampling interval, and I'm going to look for the 5,300, the 10,300, and so on. So I go to the next one, count number 3, I added 14. That brings me up to 2350, but I'm looking for what? The $5,300. So I go to the next account, and when I go to that next account now, that's what? That's 4,350. When I add that in, the total goes to 6,700. So now I have found my what? I have found my $5,300. That one is starred because I'm going to send out the confirmation for that. Now I'm looking for my 10,300. So I come to this next one, add in 23. That only gets me up to 9. But when I look at the next one now, I add in the 4,900. That gets me up to the 13,900. I have found my what? $10,300. Then I go to the next guy. And when I go to the next guy now, he is what? Bigger than an interval. So I know he has to be selected because I'm looking for my $15,300. And if this one is 8.5, then he's gone over my interval. I know he's going to be selected. And not only does he contain my $15,300, $15,300, he also contains what? My $20,300. So I get to do what? Send one confirmation out for this guy, and I get to test 2 of my sample items just by sending out one confirmation. I'm testing my $15,300 and my $20,300 just by sending this one confirmation out. That's what we mean as an advantage to PPS sampling, dollar unit sampling. It automatically stratifies the sample. The larger the account balance, the more likely it is that it'll be picked because you have more dollars sitting in front of you. Okay. Now, this is describing the way this would be done if we were stuck on a desert island somewhere with nothing but a calculator and a ledger book. The way these things are done now is you go to a software like IDEA, a data analytics type software, and you sit there and you put in what is my risk of incorrect acceptance, what is my tolerable misstatement, and you put those factors into the software, and the software then calculates your sample size, comes up with your sampling interval, comes up with a random start, and you can literally go home, sleep, and overnight the computer system will do what? Reach into your client's files and pull out your sample items and probably even generate the confirmation letter, and probably then all you have to do is hit send to some system or something that'll send those confirmations out to your client's customer or whatever. And so this is nowadays a highly automated process, and that's why everybody uses dollar unit sampling, PPS sampling now, as opposed to some of those variables units we were talking about earlier. Okay, variables methods we were talking about earlier, and so on. I'm not going to go through this whole table. Okay, question. Okay, so once you have gone ahead and selected the sample, then you send out the confirmations, however that works, probably going to be done electronically. And when you send out the confirmations now, you start getting amounts that come back. We have an error here. The, recorded amount was 800, and the person came back and said, well, I made a $200 payment that isn't reflected here. So the difference is $200. You take that 200, you divide it by what? The recorded value of 8. We've got a 25% tainting. We then apply that tainting to the sampling interval. So each sample item represents its interval. And now our projected error is 1250. Notice this is a little more precise than what we were doing with the variable sampling plans, where we were projecting to the whole population in one big chunk. Here we're doing it by interval. Okay. Now you come up to this next one, and there's no error there. If there's no error, then the error rate is 0%. No error, no projected error. Then we come up to this next one, 4,900, and they have what? They have completely messed this up. It's 100% error, so we determined that that entire interval is an error. Now, this is where this gets important here, okay? Now, this is where it gets trickier. It's all been important, but it gets tricky here. Let's look at this one. Here now, remember we had that 8,500 that was bigger than the interval. If that's the case, you just simply calculate the difference between the audited value and the book value, and you do what? You record that entire amount as your projected misstatement, the entire difference between those. Now, don't write this down because sometimes I think students get confused and they think I'm telling you this is the correct way of doing this. This is the way you don't do it. If you were to go ahead and do the tainting approach here, you would end up with an error rate, a tainting rate of about 18.8%. And so if you took 0.188 and then you multiplied that by the interval of 5,000, the answer you would get would be 941.13 or something stupid like that. How can that be? How can you say you only have an error of 941.13 when you know your error was greater than that? It was 1,600. Okay, so no, this is a no-no. Don't do this. If you have an item, a sample item that's bigger than your interval, you just take the error straight over to your projected column. Okay, and then finally, we've got this last one that's in error. It's $300. 300 divided by 15 gives me 20% error. I multiply that by the sampling interval. That gives me projected error of 1,000. I add these guys up, and my projected error is 8,850. Now, let me ask you, is this auditor satisfied with that there's not a material misstatement? Projected error is 8850 using this dollar unit set, using PPS sampling. Is the auditor happy? The auditor satisfied, do you think? What was my tolerable misstatement? Hello? What was my tolerable misstatement? Oh, wow. Man, I guess I'll just go ahead and end the class because I lost the class. Gee, I guess that's just the end of the class, right? Because I lost you guys. You're gone.
It was 15,000.
Okay, so the tolerable misstatement was what? Was 15,000. I have a projected misstatement of what? Of 8,850. So what's the auditor thinking here?
They're happy.
Yeah, they're kind of happy. I mean, they're thinking, okay, I probably don't have a material misstatement, but what? The auditor would start to consider qualitative considerations. What was the cause of the deviation? Was it because of some problem with internal control? Are we seeing indications of fraud? I'll tell you right now, this one's got me concerned. Okay. And so you would always need to be considering what qualitative considerations along with, just the comparison to the tolerable misstatement. Okay, good. Now, dual purpose testing is something that can be done that most entities would do. Most audit organizations would combine your control testing with your actual substantive testing. Now, that can be a little bit problematic if, as you're doing your control testing, you're thinking you have controls that have operating effectiveness, and then as you go through and do the control test and go, oops, we have a problem, I have to increase my sample, then you're going to have to, go back through and figure out what your sample size needs to be for your substantive testing if you start to encounter some errors. But auditors deal with that kind of a situation all the time. Okay. Okay, good. Let's go ahead then and let's take a look at some multiple choice questions. Okay, guys, go ahead and take your best shot at this one. Okay, all right, and so yeah, most of us got this right, although we're 50%. But let's just go ahead and see how we would work this. And it's very, very much what we did in the little example we went through. So we're using PPS. We have a sampling interval of 10,000. Now, if I'm working this question, I'm sitting there and I'm sticking that 10,000 down there because I know that that is my interval, and I'm probably going to apply some tainting to that. An auditor discovered that a selected account receivable with a recorded amount of 5,000, so that's the book value, had an audited amount of 4,000. So in this particular example, I have what? I have $1,000 difference. Now, if the recorded amount was 5,000 and I have a $5,000, if the recorded amount was 4,000, the recorded amount is 5,000 and the audited amount is 4,000, then I have what? I'm trying to say not very well, that I have a 20% tainting there. So I take that 20% tainting and I do what? I apply it to the sampling interval, and that gives me what? That gives me a projected error here of 2,000, just like we did in the example. Okay, all right, good. Let's take a look at number 2, question 2. Okay, let's go ahead and make a selection. I'm back to that one person that never answers the question, but let's just go ahead and take a look. And okay, most of us got it right. Again, we're at 60% here, okay, but B is the correct answer. Now, okay, let's just take a look and understand a little bit better what we mean by stratification. Okay, so what happens? Let's say an auditor is looking at, and we'll stick with the accounts receivable example. I'm looking at my client's account receivable, and they have account receivable number 1, and say that one's 100,000, and they have AR 2, and that one's 100,000, and they have AR 3, And let's say that one is, 50,000, just trying to make the math easy for me. AR4 is 50,000. And then let's say they have AR5 through 100, okay, the remaining 96, right? Have an average amount, they're all kind of tightly clustered around, say, $5,000. Okay, now what happens? I add up the entire receivable, and let's say the entire receivable balance, I don't know, is 500,000. And please, somebody don't say, well, it's impossible if you have an average of 5,000 plus those other ones to get to 500,000. This is just an example that I'm just making up as I go along. If the entire recorded balance is 500,000, here's what I would do. I would sit here and I would pick what? I would pick 1, 2, that's 3, that's 200,000 plus these, that's $300,000. I would stratify and automatically pick those. I would include them because together they're constituting what? 300,000 divided by the 500,000. I'm clearly over exaggerating this example, but I would get what? I would get 80% of the dollars. Am I doing my math right? 3 divided by 5. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to do what? I'm not waiting for you guys to answer. I would do what? I would go ahead and I would audit 80% of my dollars here by only looking at what? Less than 5% of the total accounts. There's a total of 100 and I'm only looking at 4. This is stratification, okay? So what happens in this example, this population had highly variable recorded amounts. We had some big ones at the top and then a bunch of little ones at the bottom. And that's when the auditor would probably start to stratify. PPS automatically stratifies a sample. I don't have to go through this exercise to pick these out because PPS is automatically going to select those with larger dollar amounts, okay? The auditor's tolerable misstatement is extremely small. If that's the case, then what? I'm not going to want to carve off some big chunk ones because I've got to look at all of these little ones to figure out if they contain this material misstatement. And C and D are the same way of saying, or a different way of saying the same thing. The standard deviation is relatively small. That means I've got tightly clustered items in that universe, and I'm not going to be able to apply stratification. Okay? Okay, good. Let's look at number 3. Okay, a couple of things. 3 divided by 5 is 60%. So I made that mistake up there. It's not 80%, it's 60%. Okay, but still this point is maintained. Okay, good. All right, let's look at this question here. And okay, most of us got it right. I'm not sure why there was some desire to pick B. Identical to a deviation discovered in a prior year's audit maybe just means that my client tends to make that mistake. Okay, so it doesn't really give me broader consideration of the implications as much as what most of us pick, which is D, that it was initially concealed by a forged document. Now I'm starting to run into some fraud considerations, and that's going to have me reevaluating every single decision I've made up until this point, because now I've actually discovered the fraud. Remember, we talked earlier in this chapter about fraud considerations, okay? Caused by an employee's misunderstanding of the instructions, I would probably rank that as number 2 here, because it could mean that there's a control risk that I maybe hadn't seen before that's going to start to drive up my risk of material misstatement, and then 4 would have broader implications. But the word forgery in here is what caused this to be clearly the right answer. Okay. All right, good. Let's go ahead and get out of this. And by now you should have ordered your 4.0 textbook, guys. If there's anything in your head that is thinking that I'm not going to order the textbook yet, purge that from your mind. You need to get in there into the software and you need to order the textbook for 4.0. Any question on that? Okay. All right, good. So what I want to do is I'm going to 4.0 now, and I'm not going to go back through all of chapter 3. As I've said, what we'll do is we'll call out areas where there's been a significant change in the materials, and this really is applicable for folks that are, which I think is most of you, that are going to be taking the exam after July 1st or July 1st or after. Okay, so we've got a new module down here now, this module 10. This is posted on e-learning, and when you order your book, the 4.0 book, it will obviously be bound inside of your 4.0 chapter 3 module 10. Question? Okay, now data analytics, and I know that everybody walks around now in the accounting and auditing profession and says, hey, data analytics, ADA. Okay, and what happens is you start thinking, okay, I'm haven't had a lot of experience with data analytics, so I'm not going to be able to pass the CPA exam. No. What's going to happen, and we have a class here at GGU that focuses on data analytics, so that's great. You're going to probably have taken or will be taking that class, so that's helpful too. But what we're really dealing with here is more definitional. We're going to go through, and you can see that it is at a high level, basic discussion about data analytics, what they allow auditors to do, what the different data analytic techniques are, etc. Okay, so it is not going to sit there and say, okay, extract a file from here and do this analysis. It's simply talking to you about some definitions and some terms, just sort of getting your feet wet when it comes to data analytics. Okay, so we start to talk about, and I need to get myself back into full screen mode, and we start to talk about the benefits of data analytics. Okay, and let's go ahead and just flashcard a couple of these. The thing that is very useful with data analytics now is because the system can go through and you can put certain parameters, and data analytics software can go through and look at the entire population to see if any transactions actually fall outside of certain parameters. And if they do, then those will automatically be selected for the auditor to take a closer look at those. Okay, so we're not nearly as limited as we would be if we were trying to visually or manually do that process. if you go ahead and have software that will identify transactions that meet certain requirements. Okay. As a result, because we can identify fraud indicators, right, we can go through and we can analyze the entire population of transactions, and we can see if there are any indicators of fraud on those. And of course, those would then be selected for the auditor to take a closer look at. Okay, so just flashcard those two key benefits of data analytics. Okay, now let's look at the steps in data analytics and applying ADA, which is audit data analytics. Okay, is what they mean by ADA. I don't know if I like that, because there's a Americans with Disabilities Act is also ADA. So I don't know, Becker, whoever should have thought about using that abbreviation there. But anyway, what happens? We have the steps. Now, what I'm going to do is ask you to flashcard what are sort of the more key descriptive type steps that I can see being in a multiple choice question or something. And again, we're more descriptive in what we're doing here. So first, we have to plan the audit data analytics. And this step includes assessment of what data is needed, the most appropriate technique, which tools and outputs will be used in the assessment of the outcome. So flashcard that step, okay? Then we will have to do what? Obviously access and obtain the data, and there will be cleaning and validating the extraction. So you're going to have to do something to make sure that if you have the extraction has been complete. Maybe you're going to use some sort of control total or something like that to clean and validate the extraction. Okay, and then of course, key step, review and analyze the relevance of the data, of the reliability of the source data. So reliability of the data is key. Okay, if you already have a client that is having some sort, I want you to flashcard these ones I've highlighted. If you have a client that already has some IT weaknesses, then maybe you can't rely on that data that you're pulling for your data analytic because their system is already flawed. So you would first have to be satisfied that they have a reliable system, and then you could go ahead and start to do these steps of obtaining the data, validating, extracting it, cleaning it, etc. Okay. Now, we can take a look and we can see that the data analytics can have various descriptive, there can be various descriptive analytics, okay? And so descriptive analytic techniques include summarizing statistics, data sorting, aging data, and data reduction, okay? So you can go ahead and do different sorts and whatnot. They're going to allow you to analyze to see something that's going on with this entity. I'm not going to go through these examples for every single one of these because they get a little tedious in some of these examples, and I don't think you get much from the examples. But taking a look at diagnostic analytics. So we have descriptive but diagnostic, and a classic example of a diagnostic analytic is variance analysis, period over period analysis. Okay, so some of these analytics can be descriptive, right? Some of them can be diagnostic. And so go ahead and flashcard examples of diagnostic. Okay, then you come over and predictive, allowing you to look forward and see what some future outcome is going to be. And this is really where you hear a lot of talk about data analytics now. And so go ahead and flashcard the predictive analysis. Regression analysis is going to be looking at the relationship between some sort of independent variable and dependent variable. And that's going to allow you to then what? Use a scatter plot to see how those things are trending, if they're correlated. All of that is regression analysis, and you can do, that's an example of a predictive analysis. Forecasting, time series modeling, classification, sediment analysis. Okay, just flashcard these as what? Predictive analytics. Okay, then you can have prescriptive analytics, and go ahead and flashcard some of the examples of prescriptive analytics. Say that 10 times fast. What if analysis, decision support, machine learning, natural language processing. Again, you can see that much of what we're doing here is just giving you definitions and examples around those definitions. Okay, and prescriptive analytics are probably the most complex and advanced type as well. So you can include that on your flashcard. Okay. Now, when we are going to apply data analytics to some of the terms we've already learned, right? For example, risk assessment. Okay. And these really are what? Are planning. Remember, we said you have to do planning analytics in every engagement. So you can use data analytic processes to help you identify previously unidentified risk, identify risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level. So they tell us we have to do analytics, and you can do high-level analytics during the planning phase as part of your risk assessment. Okay, and you can see here they use a bar chart to kind of see how you know, different parts of the entity are comparing to budgets, that sort of thing. Okay, all right, good. Now you come over to the next page, and you can use data analytics and test of controls. And guys, this is to me one of the key things that data analytics does now is it allows you to go ahead and do your tested controls over the entire universe. I mean, we just spent some amount of time talking about using sampling for tested controls, but if you're if you can put certain parameters and use a data analytics that looks at every single transaction to see if it has the credit approval or whatever, now you're not even having to use sampling, and then you would know exactly how many transactions the control wasn't applied to, and the data analytics software would allow you to do that. The other thing that I don't hear talked about much, and I don't know why compliance auditors haven't gotten more into discussing how data analytics can be used to check compliance. So not only could you test controls, but you can test compliance with laws and regulations by looking to see if the transaction falls out of certain legal parameters or not. So there hasn't been a lot of talk about that. I've asked that question about a couple of CPA firms that I've talked with that do quite a bit of compliance auditing. And so far, I don't think the industry has started to scratch the surface at all in terms of talking about how to use data analytics for compliance testing. Okay, and you can use it for your tested controls. Again, they're not mentioning compliance testing here, but it could be used for that, even though they're not mentioning it. And probably the exam wouldn't ask you that. But then you could also use it for substantive procedures. And of course, the big one is the analytical procedures, right? We know that the data analytic software and whatnot is going to allow for that. But also you can use it as a test of details. And you can, again, test the entire population. So if the discussion is that there shouldn't be any transaction in the repairs and maintenance account in excess of a certain dollar amount, you could use these data analytic techniques to run through the entire universe of transactions, including the repairs and maintenance account, and have it extract back to you any transactions that exceed a certain dollar threshold, etc. Okay. Okay, good. And then again, you can use it for analytical procedures, and I think that's self-explanatory as we're making comparison between different parameters and the actual results. Okay, and then you can use the data analytics to conclude the audit. Remember, we said you have to do a set of data analytics at the end of the engagement, and so a set of analytical procedures at the end of the engagement. And again, the data analytics can help with that. So notice, guys, that we're taking the things that we've already talked about, and we're talking about how data analytics can be used as a tool to come in and help you with the various phases of the audit. Again, highly descriptive discussion here. They're not having you go through a database and clean the data and whatnot. They are simply asking you, do you understand these terms? Okay. Now, the sources for your data analytics obviously are going to be your various information systems, accounting information system, obviously, management information system, etc. But just remember, obviously, information systems that are more robust are going to provide more data that can be used in data analytics. Okay. Okay, good. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different data types. And you can have structured data, and structured data is organized, easily searchable. Okay, so hopefully you have clients that have what structured data that you can go ahead and then do whatever sorts or extractions or whatnot that you want to do on that data. Now you come over to the next page, and of course, you could have unstructured data, and unstructured data is essentially not structured, do you think? Okay, and so it's basically in an unmodified format and remains that way until transformed and modified for analysis. Okay, I would think that most of your data analytics these days, right now anyway, are going to be performed on more structured data than unstructured. Okay. Okay, good. Now you come down, and of course we have to be satisfied with the reliability of the data. So the majority of data is sourced from some type of information system. As a result, you will need to understand the IT controls, and you're probably going to look at the general IT controls there, disaster recovery, password use, that sort of thing. Okay, but the data needs to be reliable. And you can take a look at some of your procedures for determining reliability. And you come over to the next page, and one of the key things that needs to be done with data reliability is making sure that you have complete data. Okay, and that was always something that I would talk to folks quite a bit about. They would get into data reliability procedures and at GAO, and what they would generally do is talk to the agency, and it's a good step, talk to the agency to see if they had any system trust audits done, that sort of thing, and they would get those, but that is more of a control test. You would then want to do some sort of substantive procedure on top of that, and I was a big believer of one of the substantive procedures would be making sure the data is complete. So look to some sort of output document and see if that data is actually included in the system for completeness. And sometimes you'll find, they're losing a certain amount of data. And if that's the case, that's not going to be a good system for you to use data analytics, or you're going to have to clean that up, right? We talked about cleaning before you can use that data. Okay, so you can see that I want you to flashcards. Some of these reliability steps are a little more important than others, I think. Reconciling data, okay, utilizing known aggregation points and accounting rules provided within the accounting information, okay, so aggregation transaction data to tie to subsidiary balances, aggregating subledgers, subsidiary balance to general ledgers, tying general ledger data directly to the entity's financial statements, okay? I mean, this gotta be done in every audit, whether you use data analytic techniques or not. I don't care if you have to use a calculator. The general ledger has to reconcile to the subsidiary ledgers. Subsidiary ledgers have to reconcile to journals. Journals have to reconcile to, sales journals have to reconcile, the sales in the general ledger has to reconcile to the sales journal. All of that needs to reconcile before, if you're going to go and select a set of invoices, then the total of the invoices have to reconcile to the total of the sales journal. Otherwise, you're not auditing the financial statements. So all of that has to, match up and reconcile, and the data analytics software would help you with that important step, okay, for your data reliability procedures. Okay, good. Coming over now and looking at procedures performed for visualization. Okay, so this is sort of the fun part of the data analytics then is what? How do you prepare the data output? How do you prepare the output now in a manner that allows you to look and make some sort of conclusion based on the way the data is presented? Okay, so data visualization, take complex activities and put them into charts, that sort of thing. Okay, now when you come over and you start to take a look now, they talk about the data, different data analytic techniques that we've talked about, and then line those up with different visualization techniques. So I think that's a pretty useful thing. I'm going to ask you to flashcard all this, okay? So if you're doing regression analysis usually uses scatter points, okay? So I think you've seen that when you've done output of regression analysis, right, you have this kind of thing and they fit a line that is consistent with these different scatter points, okay? That's a good way to see how the different observations are correlated or maybe not correlated based on the outcome of that scatter plot, okay? Variance analysis, they tell us, hey, a bullet chart can be helpful and shows bar chart values against lines designating, say, the budget. So you're looking at that variance analysis and you can see here these various bullet points here, or bullet chart where, hey, here's was the budget, and then here's where the actual was either over or under the budget. Okay, so these would be the little bullets that you'd be using there. Okay, okay, good. Coming over, okay, period over period analysis, and basically for period over period analysis, they're telling us that a bar column would be a good way to do a period over period analysis, because you can sit here and compare, you know, 1 year's, in this example, net income to another year's net income, and you can group those by quarter in this example, okay? If you're looking for classification, classic way to do that is a pie chart, okay? And some of this gets a little self-explanatory, I think, guys. I think you know how a pie chart works. Okay. All right, good. And then trend analysis, no kidding, right? We can flashcard this, but trend analysis, of course, is going to be line charts are the best way to do a trend analysis. You can flashcard that. I think y'all know what a line chart looks like. Okay, good. Now, evaluating and grouping potential misstatements, okay? So the auditor can divide items found in the output into two broad categories: clearly inconsequential or clearly not inconsequential, or not clearly inconsequential. Now, if something is clearly inconsequential, that means the auditor believes that these items do not pose a risk to material misstatement. Okay, so you can have certain misstatements that you have identified and clear and use some sort of threshold to categorize them into clearly not consequential or clearly inconsequential. Okay, and then those that rise to a certain dollar amount, you can group those into not clearly unconsequential, say that 10 times fast. The auditor may group these items into common characteristics found among them. The auditor would then determine the possible misstatement, and after the groups are evaluated for further analysis and see if they actually do represent misstatements. Okay, okay, good. All right, let's go ahead with that quick discussion and let's take a look at a couple multiple choice questions. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. And yeah, most of it's got it right. And when we talked about data reliability steps, we didn't even really talk about the idea that data that is, external would be better than data that is internally generated. And so D was the only one that was externally generated, this government, um, you know, weather site. I mean, there's all kinds of, it's not like the weather is a secret. Okay, I don't know that you have to go to the government, but you'd want to use something that is external would be a better source. And so this government example here, D, would be the one that is external. All these others were internal. So notice here that even though they're asking a question about data analytics and data reliability, you could sort of panic and say, oh, what am I supposed to do here? But notice the fact that you've already understood from our discussion about reliability of data already in general, what data is more reliable than others, external versus internal. So I think it's important that you look at these definitions and flashcard these definitions that we talked about, but it's not like they're just, opening up a whole new can of worms that we haven't dealt with here. It's taking what we've learned and using these data analytic techniques to get us through the various aspects of the audit. Okay. All right, good. Let's try this one. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and talk about this one now in the poll. And okay, most of us got it right, 70%. Some folks were in favor of D, line chart, and a couple of key things here. One, they talked about using linear regression. And so we've got what? We've got a clear flashcardable item here that I asked you a flashcard, which is what? The scatter plot is what's best for linear regression. But let's just back up and say you forgot that flashcard. Well, linear regression is what? Is the comparison of a independent variable like the weather to an dependent variable like what? Like energy usage, and seeing if there's some sort of correlation. And so that's what was going on here. Line chart is going to be more what? Where we have not this sort of, cause and effect kind of relationship, where the thing's going like this or the thing's going like this. If it's negative correlated, what a line chart's going to do is what? Over time, a longitudinal analysis, sometimes things are up, sometimes they're down. It's better to use a line chart if you're trying to do a year over year type analysis that we talked about for the line chart. Okay, or trend analysis, I should say. So regression analysis, scatter plot is showing a relationship, whereas a trend analysis is showing how things change over time. Okay, question? All right, so we're not going to get to chapter 4. I think we are now officially a full chapter behind. So we're just going to have to keep fighting that good fight to get through all the material here before we completely run out of days that are available for us to go through this material, okay? So we will pick up chapter 4 on Tuesday, on Monday. You've got the rest of this week now and the weekend to make sure that you're getting through pretty good on this homework, okay? So I'm going to be taking a look pretty quickly at how you're doing in your chapter 1, chapter 2, maybe take a little peek at chapter 3 to see that you're working your way through your homework. So make sure I don't have to look and then send you an email saying, hey, what are you doing? Okay. Question? Okay, guys, I will see you on Monday. Have a good weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Okay.